Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about the next step in discovery writing. This may be the last video. Yeah, this may be the last video, I think. What we're going to do is now talk about what to do after you're done with the writing stage. We've already talked about sort of the philosophy of discovery writing and why you might want to use discovery writing, ways to improve your intuition so that way discovery writing kind of flows a little better or works a little better for you. And then I think with the last video we talked about was what is the actual, or yeah, the last two videos were like what the actual writing process is like. What was it like to actually sit down at a computer and write without an outline, with maybe even no real sense of a plot or a problem or something else like that. And if you remember we talked about before, it's usually best to have some sort of hook to get at least your brain started. Some people like to use like the title of a book. Some people like to have well thought out characters. Some people like to have well thought out setting, and some people just have like an interesting problem and they just kind of want to see how it could play out in a particular scenario or something else like that. So now what we're going to talk about is what to do when you're done. You've done all the writing and you've come to the end of the story. What comes next? One thing to point out is the way I typically write is what we call cycling, or where I write a little bit and I go back over what I used to write and then I went on and I keep going and I keep going and that sort of thing. So theoretically, when I get to the end of the story, I'm done. I've written it all in like one clean copy. It usually doesn't work out quite that way. Maybe someday I'll get there where my writing style and chops are perfect enough that I can just sort of crank out a story and be done and have it be ready to send off. What I usually like to do is, I do that cycling, I kind of go back and forth, and then when I get to the end, I'll just go all the way back to the beginning and read it straight through, making little changes as I go. With a short story, that's pretty nice. It's kind of easy. With a novel, that's a little bit, sort of a pain in the butt because I'm usually sitting there for many hours rereading my own novel, kind of making some little changes along the way. Mainly because, I typically write from the beginning of the story to the end of the story. I don't necessarily jump around. Some people like to write like the action scenes, or they like to skip the action scenes and go back to it. Some people like to write the dialogue or add that sort of thing. I'm pretty much writing from the start of chapter 1 to the end of the last chapter, and that sort of thing. And with a short story, that works out really well. With a novel, it's a little trickier because I'm not an incredibly fast writer. I'm fast compared to some folks, but it can still take me a few months, several months to finish a novel. So guaranteed, the way I was writing at the beginning of the book is probably not the same as at the beginning of the book. The theme and the tone and the style might have changed over time. And so what I'm really trying to do at that point is, still staying in my sphere of creative voice, my intuitive voice, is just making sure all of that stuff seems to match up. I'm also reading for like plot holes. I might have stuck something in there that just doesn't make sense later on in the book. It either might be completely superfluous and unnecessarily confuse the reader. Sometimes you want to, confuse the reader, especially for writing mysteries. You want to put in maybe some red herrings or some dead ends. But in other books, if you have a whole chapter dedicated to this one event and it never came up again, and you really can't think of another reason why to, keep that in there, that might be another thing. Checking for other inconsistencies, when I wrote Memories in the City, which was a mystery novel that I wrote, using discovery writing, so from start to finish, I didn't really know what was going to happen. I didn't know how things were going to play out. It only started to kind of come alive, halfway through the book. But somewhere along the line, I switched the name of the mother and the daughter. Don't know why, but yeah, luckily I reread my book and I caught that somewhere around chapter 7 or 8 or something, I started switching the names of the two people. luckily I was consistent because all I had to do is like fix it from the first few chapters. I decided I liked how I had it, towards the end of the book. So that's the sort of level of editing that I'm doing, is still much more creative mode. Um, if I find something that doesn't, to me, just doesn't read clearly, I'm not exactly certain who's saying what at this point. One of my banes is the what's it called, unclear antecedent. You know, John, Robert, and Sam went to the movies and he had a good time. He who, John, Robert, or Sam. That's the unclear antecedent sort of thing. That usually it's pronouns that get me. Too many he's and she's, and you have to put in just enough proper names to add a little bit of clarity, or something else using character tags to kind of give you an idea. And that's a whole other sort of topic. But making sure things read clearly, that's another big part. But what I'm not doing is I am not trying to appease the grammar Nazis. I'm not trying to appease the folks who are sticklers on that level of writing. Because in fiction, sometimes I want to break the rules. I want a long run-on sentence because I want to show that this is a sort of an idea that just sort of goes on and on and on. I want the reader to be a little bored or a little confused or whatever. This is really great in dialogue where you have a character that just sort of drones on and on and on, and you just have this block of text that maybe there's a few commas, but there's no periods. It's just one long run-on sentence. That can do a thing. I'm a big fan of sentence fragments, because to me that implies a lot of action, a lot of movement. A trick that I noticed that Stephen King used to use a lot was he would use just a word or a simple phrase repeatedly to sort of get across the same sort of idea, and so I like doing that as well. So I am not that concerned about editing for grammar. Again, you want to be clear. So if a word is misspelled and it's so misspelled that people don't know what it means, and that needs to be changed. If the grammar is, if I am breaking some grammar rule and it is not, making the story clear, it's going to confuse people, that sort of thing, then yeah, that's the sort of things I want to change. But that's why, for the most part, I don't really use like Grammarly or Pro Writing Aid. I mean, I do use them, but in that sense, I'm looking for them to catch my big mistakes in spelling, because I write with all the spelling and grammar checkers turned off. I do not care about that in the writing phase as I'm putting words on a page. I don't want all the little red and blue squiggly lines popping up and confusing me, because my brain will immediately go to that and try and figure out, why is it underlying there? Oh, because I used the wrong version of there, so I need to change that. Now all of a sudden I'm not in my discovery writing phase. I've broken out of my intuitive phase. Not to get too esoteric, but that's the reason why a lot of like card readers or people who are using some sort of intuitive sense, they kind of want to block out the rest of the world. They'll play loud music. They will put a hood up over their face to kind of like create blinders. They just look down at the thing and they try not to look up at anything else or notice anything else around them, because to stay in that sort of intuitive flow state, you need to kind of focus all your senses towards the thing that's driving your intuition. Again, it's like if you're reading tarot cards, you lay out the tarot cards on a table. Maybe you have the lights down low. You have just a light, down where you can see the cards themselves. Playing sort of ambient music. That's the reason why, like ambient music, you don't want anything with words, because that will kind of confuse your own words. That sort of thing, to sort of create this sort of special place. And so when your grammar checker or your spell checker is on, it's going to like light up as you're writing, because guaranteed you're going to make some mistakes even if they're unintentional, or you're going to do like I was describing where you're intentionally writing a run-on sentence or a sentence fragment, or you're capitalizing a word because in your sort story that word is important, it's a proper name, but your grammar checker hasn't read your story, so doesn't know. So just having those little things go off is going to pull you out of that intuitive state. So I don't write with them on, and I save that for the very, very end. After I've done my full read through again, then I turn on my grammar checker, and then I go through it once more again so that way I can kind of see, oh yeah, I used the wrong version of there here, and the grammar checker caught that. It's usually a lot more frustrating because it's alerting me that I misspelled words, and I'm like, well, this is because it's a weird fantasy name that I made up or something, or I'm using like Slavic names that my grammar checker doesn't recognize. They're proper names, but not in English, and so Grammarly doesn't know that. But that's really about it. I am not rewriting whole sections. I am not moving things around. Again, unless it's getting involved in the clarity problem, I am not letting myself second guess my intuition. If I wrote it, even if it was weeks ago, if I wrote it then and I described it in a particular way, I'm just going to let that go. I'm going to let that be my intuitive side, my little inner toddler, inner 3-year-old, as Dean Wesley Smith liked to put it. I'm going to let that just sort of have its way. It's kind of like, the example that Dean Wesley Smith uses, and it's a really good one because I think it really encapsulates it. If a 4-year-old showed you a picture of a tiger that they drew, and they're really proud of that picture of that tiger, oh, look, this tiger that I drew, but they made it purple. They got a purple tiger. If you said, that's not a tiger, kid, tigers aren't purple, do it again. That's your critical voice telling your little kid creative voice, you screwed up. Even though there was no intention, the 4-year-old doesn't know what a tiger looks like maybe, or maybe they do, they just like the color purple and they decide my tiger's going to be purple. In fiction, you can kind of just do that. You can just have purple tigers. You can have elves rule the world. You can have aliens invade planet Earth. You can have a secret cabal of serial killers that run New York City or whatever. That actually might be true. That may not be fiction. But anyway, you can do that. But if you keep telling your creative voice, no, that's wrong. Can't say that, don't do that, can't put it that way, can't describe it that way, eventually that just goes away. If you don't trust your intuition will leave you. And that's why sometimes you just have to go with it. And in the realm of fiction writing particularly, you can do whatever the hell you want. You are the god of your own universe. There is no wrong when it comes to writing. I think it was Dean Wesley Smith again that said that the only real thing that's really wrong in writing is if you're just unclear. If I am trying to tell you a story and the way I've described things, the language that I use or whatever, is just not clear, then you could argue that I've done it wrong. Or if it's just, some certain craft sort of things. If I want an action scene to be really important and really impactful, and I'm just using long run-on sentences and just seem to drag out the pace of the story, well, excuse me, then you could argue I've done it wrong. I would argue more that you just haven't done it well. That's more of a skill and a craft and a practice problem, as opposed to this isn't how you're supposed to do it. Because I'd be willing to bet if you dug through enough books, eventually you'll find an action scene that is one long run-on sentence that works great. In fact, it's probably true with a lot of the older stories. Reread Princess of Mars, and I'll be willing to bet there's some action scenes that are kind of like that. But that was also a different time, different writing time. So that's why it's important to be very careful during the editing stage of making sure that you're not second-guessing your intuition. You're doing really what some people would call a very superficial edit. Some people, their editing stage, they'll have like multiple drafts or something else like that, where they just keep rewriting. to the point that the words on the page that they wrote, the first time around look nothing like the words at the end. And usually what happens is you end up taking all of your voice out. You take all of the creativity, you take all of the fun and the excitement out, and you make your book kind of read and sound like everybody else's. And some marketers would say that's exactly what you want to do. Find a style. Harry Potter worked. Write all your books just like J.K. Rowling's, and then you'll be a success. I don't know. Maybe there's some truth to that. But I do know that no one breaks out. No one stands out by just seeming like everybody else. I think I did another video where we're on the verge of an indie revolution. I think that's kind of coming, if it's not already here, where people are just looking for something kind of new and different. Maybe it's my own potential bias, but I keep seeing sword and sorcery and science fantasy stuff pop up all over the place. Whether it's books, movies, a little bit of video games, role-playing games, a lot of role-playing games. Because I think people are now looking for something different. They don't want just another Dungeons & Dragons knockoff. They want something new and unique, even if it's a little weird. And if you do your editing over and over and over again, keep redrafting and stuff, you end up making yourself, it's kind of the nature of the process. You start making your stuff sound more like just serve everybody else. And then what's the point? Now you're just kind of copying everybody else. There's the notion of like, well, but it's not the best story it could possibly be. And if I keep editing it, I will make it the better story. I will, think of a new way to describe something, a new analogy or something else like that. There might be some truth to that. My thought is that the risk is not worth the reward. The risk of making your story sound like everybody else is not worth the potential reward of coming up with a few clever lines or something. I think it's better, and this is sort of my approach, is just keep writing. Write a different story. Maybe even write like basically the same story with different characters or a different setting. If you like the problem, but you're not exactly sure how it worked out, just use that same problem and create a different character or a different setting and do it a different way. That's not unlike what a lot of the pulp writers used to do. You look at like somebody Lester Dent, maybe a little bit of Robert E. Howard, to some degree, H.P. Lovecraft. The plots for a lot of these are basically the same, and if you really get into Robert E. Howard stuff, he's most famous for Conan the Barbarian, but he also did Kull the Conqueror. He did Solomon Kane. He did a bunch of like boxing stories. He kind of, I think when he towards the end when he killed himself, he was actually writing a lot of westerns. You dig through that, you see that he was basically using a lot of the same kind of characters. Kull the Conqueror is not that much different than Conan the Barbarian. Very similar worlds, very similar problems. He was just sort of telling these stories in different ways. And so I think in many ways it's that sort of, if you feel like the story that you just finished isn't like the best it could be, write it again. Do it a little differently. Sometimes it's called redrafting, which I think is where basically you don't rewrite the story. You take the manuscript you got and you throw it out, and based upon what you know, you just sit down and write the whole story again, and totally new. Even if you try and redo it again, you're going to do something a little different. If you're listening to your intuition will make subtle little different choices along the way, and eventually you'll come up with something. And then you'll have two manuscripts, and then you can kind of decide what to do with them. If you really feel like one is much better than the other, just throw out the old one, consider it practice. Or publish them both. Use a pen name, whatever. Doesn't matter. It's your work, and kind of do it that way. But being very careful at the editing stage, because you can undo all of the good stuff that we've talked about with discovery writing in the editing stage. You just kind of take it all and you just sort of grind it down to where it just looks like every other story out there. And that is one of the best parts of discovery writing, is that because you're not trying to follow some formula, because you're not trying to follow some plot, it will probably be different than a lot of the other stuff that other people have written to some degree. It'll probably be very different than the other stuff that you write to some degree. And that's the interesting part. And I really do think that is going to be a big part of the indie revolution that's coming. Is people are tired of the corporate bullshit. They're tired of another superhero movie that follows the same formula. As of recording this video, I think the Black Widow movie came out. The Marvel Black Widow movie came out last week, and I think someone had pointed out that the original director, I can't remember if it's for Black Widow or for another movie, but they hired a director and she quit because she was told, like right in the beginning, he's like, don't worry about the action scenes, we'll have someone else do that for you. And it kind of implied like these movies have pretty much already been made. They maybe stick in a director, who's barely worked or doesn't have much name presence, and they kind of stick them in there mainly maybe because they're more malleable. You get a Kenneth Branagh or Josh Whedon or somebody else like that. The Russo brothers, who are now much bigger because of the Marvel movies, they may say, no, I don't want to do that. I want to do my own action scenes and stuff. And so at some level, what that means is these movies are written by committee, and committee is boring. Committee is the same, especially when you talk about like a big corporate committee, where for them, this movie is totally nothing more than just a business venture. They want to stick in X amount of dollars and make X times 10 amount of dollars, and they're not going to take any risks. They're not going to do anything interesting, because when you write something risky, you might fail, and they don't want to fail. They can't fail. Whereas the sad part is failure is where you learn. Failure is where we learn new things. Whether it's in the writing or the marketing or the editing or whatever, you're going to make mistakes. And if you don't make mistakes, you can't learn from them. And so then you can't get better and you can't grow. And you're probably just playing it very safe. And so what I would say is, once you've done the writing part, be very careful with the editing. Like I said, just stick to the very superficial. Look for things that are unclear. Look for plot holes or goof ups like I did, where you switch names around, that sort of thing. And then just make changes so that the grammar isn't so wrong that it distracts from the story. Like I said, run-on sentences and sentence fragments, those are perfectly fine. But don't let your inner English teacher start to dictate how the story should sound, because she'll make it sound like everything else, and it will be boring. But anyway, let me know what you think. What's your thoughts on the editing process? Do you like to edit? Do you like to do lots of rewrites? Do you feel like you could be, if you do lots of rewrites, do you feel like you could maybe let some of that go and just write something and just sort of let it be what it is when you finally write it? Or is that do you have like a philosophical difference on this whole thing? Me personally, I hate rewriting. It sounds boring. I've never done it, and I have no real interest in doing it. But change my mind. But anyway, I will talk to you next time. Bye.